Welcome, everyone. I am Randy Schustel, Vice President, Global Technologies at Boston Scientific. I'm a member of the MDIC Board of Directors, as well as Chair of the MDIC Data Science and Technology Advisory Committee that includes external evidence methods as a project. I'm really excited for the opportunity to present today's session, focusing on MDIC external evidence framework for leveraging external data in regulatory decision-making. Those who are listening, if you're new to MDIC, we are a nonprofit, private-public partnership solely focused on how to advance regulatory science for translating innovation to the benefit of patients, working in the pre-competitive space with industry, government, academia, health organizations, as well as other nonprofits. Today we have an awesome panel. All of them work very closely with MDIC and advise help to advance our real-world evidence as well as our external evidence efforts. Let me introduce the panelists. Dr. Lily Yu is Deputy Director, Division of Biostatistics, Office of Clinical Evidence and Analysis, Office of Product Evaluation and Quality at FDA. Dr. Vandana Bhatia is Assistant Director, Division of Biostatistics, Office of Clinical Evidence and Analysis, Office of the Product Evaluation and Quality, FDA. Dr. Ted Listick, who recently assumed the role of Senior Vice President, Chief Analytics Officer at BridgeBio. Prior, he was Global Head of Biostats at Medtronic. The format for our session today is we will hear prepared presentations from Lily, Vandana, and Ted. And then after the initial presentation from each of the panelists, I have a few questions to share their perspectives. Let us dive in now as we turn to Lily to deliver an overview on various efforts at CDRH toward harnessing the power of real-world data and real-world evidence.
Hi, everyone. So today I'm going to give an overview of leveraging external evidence to support regulatory decisions. Next slide, please. Let's start off with CDRH mission: protect and promote the public health. We ensure patients and providers have timely and continued access to safe, effective, and high-quality medical devices and safe radiation-emitting products. We provide consumers, patients, their caregivers, and providers with understandable and accessible and science-based information about the products we oversee. We facilitate medical device innovation by advancing regulatory science, providing industry with predictable, consistent, transparent, and efficient regulatory pathways, and assuring consumer confidence in advances marketed in this country. To demonstrate the safety and effectiveness of a regulated product, providing data from RCT, controlled clinical trials, has been considered the gold standard. However, RCT may not be feasible for some medical device studies due to practical limitations related to device or disease condition. So different approaches and increased flexibility in trial design and statistical analysis are needed. Next slide, please. Advances in availability of real-world data, RWD, such as electronic health records, registries, lab test databases, have increased the potential to generate robust real-world evidence to support FDA regulatory decisions. the 21st Century Cures Act directed FDA to expand the role of RWE in the approval process of medical products. CDRH is committed to evaluating the potential use of real-world evidence to help support the approval of a new indication of a medical product, or to help support or satisfy post-approval study requirements. Next slide, please. CDRH has made great efforts on leveraging RWD and RWE, such as published guidance on RWE, published 90 illustrative examples of RWE used in regulatory decisions, participated in NEST CC efforts on methods and data quality frameworks, as well as MDIC's RWE framework for RVDs. Collaborating with MDIC on publishing external evidence methods framework document, which is a main topic of this session. Next one, please. In August 2017, CDRH and CBER jointly issued a guidance on RWE. The guidance defines real-world data as data relating to patient health status and/or the delivery of health care routinely collected from a variety of sources. RWD evidence is defined as the clinical evidence regarding the usage and potential benefits or risks of a medical product derived from analysis of RWD. Next one, please. RWE can be leveraged to bring new products to market, evaluate the safety and effectiveness of existing products for new uses, and assess the continued performance and safety of products once on the market. There are some important regulatory considerations in leveraging RWD and RWE. When reviewing the use of RWE to support a regulatory decision, FDA relies on scientifically robust methods and approaches to determine whether the submitted RWE is of sufficient quality to support the regulatory decision. When considering leveraging real-world data, it's essential to confirm that the RWD are fit for purpose, which refers to relevance and reliability of data. In many cases, when designing investigational study, the real-world data have been collected and the patient outcomes are available already. So it's important to ensure the scientific validity of study design and the interpretability of study results, so that consistent, predictable, transparent, and science-based regulatory decisions can be made. Next one, please. In March this year, our center issued 90 publicly available examples of different types of regulatory submissions supported by RWE. These examples come from the full range of clinical and device areas throughout CDRH and across the TPLC of the medical devices, but do not cover all submissions leveraging RWD and RWE. The experience of CDRH demonstrated by these examples illustrates the wide range of RWE that can be used in regulatory decisions. Along with these examples, the Center Director, Dr. Shuren, and OCR Director, Dr. Kennels, published an article in the FDA Voices blog on leveraging real-world evidence in regulatory submissions of medical devices. Next one, please. In February last year, collaborating with FDA, NSTAT CC published 2 frameworks on methods and data quality, respectively. Next one, please. In August 2020, MDIC issued RWE framework for RVD devices, providing statistical design considerations and statistical considerations when leveraging RWE for RVD devices. Next one, please. To support our center's strategic priorities and MDIC's initiatives on leveraging RWD and RWE, MDIC EM program was established in April 2019, which is close collaboration of FDA and MDIC. A EM survey was conducted and completed in June last year. The EM framework document was completed in January this year and opened for public comments until February 22nd. Based on the public comments, the working group is working on it toward finalizing the document. The framework is intended to provide a practical guide for the design, analysis, and evaluation of clinical evidence generated across the TPLC of medical devices when leveraging external data sources, and thereby help facilitate the innovations in medical device development and regulatory decisions. Next one, please. The document categorizes different sources of external data and some of traditional or novel statistical methods in frequent and Bayesian settings that can be used to design and analyze clinical study when leveraging external data. It also provides some regulatory submissions, examples to demonstrate the application of different statistical methods when external data have been incorporated. Next one, please. In summary, leveraging external evidence can help streamline clinical evidence generation across TPLC and speed up medical device development and regulatory decision making. The EM framework can be used across TPLC for transforming external data to scientific evidence to support regulatory decisions, combining external data with the traditional clinical studies in the pre-market, post-approval, and post-market surveillance settings. Thank you very much for your attention. So now I'm going to turn over to Vandana, who will provide the details of EM framework.
Thank you, Lily. It's my pleasure to provide an overview of the Medical Device Innovation Consortium External Evidence Methods Program. Next slide, please. This program is a collaborative effort between industry and FDA, spearheaded by Dr. Jitesh Redel from MDIC, Working group included Dr. Ted Listick from BridgeBio, as well as many of my colleagues from the Division of Biostatistics. Next slide, please. Lily very nicely just discussed the background on how we got to this point with the directive under the 21st Century Cures Act and the release of the CDRH guidance on the use of real-world evidence in 2017. So moving forward, next slide, please. In 2019, when MDIC launched the EEM program, the main aim was to help stakeholders, which is the medical device ecosystem, navigate their way through leveraging external data. And to achieve this goal, working group then developed the External Evidence Methods Framework document. And I'll go into a bit more detail of what it includes now. Next slide, please. So as Lily just mentioned, the draft MDIC EEM framework document was made available in January of this year. Note that this is an MDIC document and not an FDA guidance document. This slide shows you the table of contents of what's included in the framework. The framework starts by first describing what is external data and external evidence. It provides examples of different data sources from which external data can be obtained. A key contribution of the framework is providing a synopsis of some of the methods, statistical methods, traditional as well as novel statistical methods, applicable to design and analysis of clinical study in which external data play a main role. And of course, this is not an exhaustive list, but it's an attempt to lay out some of the methods that have already been used. It also provides illustration of some of the actual case studies, not case studies, but past studies that leveraged external data to support approval or clearance of medical devices, or it led to modification of their indications. So those examples are helpful to kind of link the methodology as well as the regulatory decision that was made for it using different external data sources. And there is also a section that describes additional methods, which are some of the novel ones that may be considered going forward in relation to other aspects of work related to NEST coordinating centers and others. Next slide, please. So let's understand first, what is external data? The term external data describes data that is external to traditional clinical study being planned. So traditional clinical study, when I say that, it refers to where all subjects are prospectively being enrolled by the study investigators themselves, right? Which is how usually a clinical study is conducted. But if there is subject level data that's available from a historical clinical study or from some other real world data source, from a registry, for example, then data on those subjects would be external to the data on subjects that is being enrolled in the traditional clinical study. In some cases, there may be no traditional clinical study planned. So in that case, all the data would be called external, right? And then external evidence is the clinical evidence that's generated by appropriate analysis of external data. Next slide, please. Here are some of the categories of data sources from which external data can be obtained. Next slide. This includes real-world data sources such as medical device registry, electronic health record, claims data, lab data, but it also includes historical clinical data, simulated data, and medical literature. So the framework defines these different sources of external data as examples of what can be utilized when considering leveraging external data. Next slide, please. This table provides a glimpse of some of the statistical methods that can be utilized when leveraging external data to generate external evidence. As you may see, column 2 and 3 here illustrates how propensity score method can be applied in a non-randomized comparative study setting. Propensity score method can be used either to construct the control arm. So the external data is being used to construct control arm in column 2, or it could be used where the external data is being used to construct both the device and the control arm for a non-randomized comparative study. And the data sources could be from different sources. So the device arm data may be coming from a registry, while control arm data may be coming from a historical clinical study, for example. Column 4 and 5 here illustrate how Bayesian hierarchical models can be used. They can be used to combine and borrow strength from multiple data sources. So one may be leveraging from national registries, for example, for real-world data collection and combining those sources together using Bayesian hierarchical model. Or could be used to augment an ongoing randomized controlled trial by leveraging data from, say, historical clinical study. Next slide, please. This table now illustrates how one can use the novel propensity score integrated method. There are several papers that were recently published on this method by Dr. Yu and others from our division of biostatistics at FDA. Column 2 here illustrates that the propensity score method can be applied when one is to leverage external data to augment a single arm clinical study. Using this information, in the external data can be incorporated into the clinical study via, say, a Bayesian power prior method or the composite likelihood approach. Column 3 illustrates that the propensity score method can be applied when one is to leverage external data to augment the control arm of a randomized control trial. So it's only being used for the control arm. And in this case, it's to augment the control arm of a randomized control trial. The method can also be used to augment both arms of the randomized control trial. And recently, there has been application of the methodology as well as in the diagnostic space. Next slide, please. So the evidence derived from external data can then potentially be used to support a wide range of regulatory decision-making, as Lily pointed out. And actually, the framework includes in it some of the examples where external evidence was derived for approval or clearance of a device or for indication expansion for a currently marketed device. Next slide, please. Sorry. Yeah. Now, whether external evidence derived from an external data source can support a specific type of regulatory decision-making is dependent upon the relevance and reliability of the external data source. If real-world data or the external data are reliable and relevant to the regulatory question at hand, then they may be considered valid scientific evidence to support pre-market or post-market regulatory decision. And here, by relevance, we mean that the data apply to the regulatory question at hand. That is, it's intended for the target patient population. It's relevant because it has enough information on the assessment of the outcome of interest. It has information on the key baseline covariates that are needed, for example, for propensity score methodology. And by reliability, we mean it has good data quality. It has adequate, not only quality, but integrity. So those are important factors to consider. As has been mentioned in the FDA real-world data guidance document, an existing real-world data source may have some inherent bias that could limit its value for drawing inferences. That therefore, to be able to mitigate the potential bias, one needs to carefully design the study. And so it's important that the study protocol and analysis plan are created prior to assessing, retrieving, and analyzing the data, regardless of whether the real-world data have already been collected or they are to be collected in the future. It is also important that measures are taken to reduce bias so that we don't jeopardize the integrity of the study. And one of the key aspects of that is to apply the outcome-free principle. That is, that the outcome data be kept out of sight during study design. And of course, clinical, regulatory, and statistical perspectives all are important to be weighed in during the study planning. Next slide, please. So in summary, studies leveraging external data need to be carefully designed, just as the traditional clinical studies, to reduce bias. Incorporating external data can help reduce the length of the study, thereby bring new, safe, and effective technologies to market sooner to help patients in need. The MDIC EM framework provides a practical guide when considering leveraging external data to generate evidence. And the draft is available on the MDIC website. I'd like to thank you for providing comments during the public comment period, and thank you for your attention today as well. And here are some of my references. With this, I would like to now thank you for your attention and turn it over to Dr. Ted Listy.
Great, thank you very much. Great presentations previously from Vandana and Lily, and for the introductions as well from Randy. So I'm going to talk today around examples and methods for external evidence. As you can see here, I'm currently with BridgeBio. I had done much of this work when I previously was the global head of biostatistics for Medtronic, and so I'll be talking mostly about those examples. So one thing to think about is, as we were getting feedback from the external evidence methods framework document, one of the things that came up is people were asking about, well, can we have even more details about the examples? And the way we've structured the document is that those details are primarily coming from what's publicly available within the FDA. Now, the FDA has more information naturally than what they can share, and the individual sponsors do as well. So this is just sort of a pre-call out for those of you watching that, if you want to continue to see this advance, if you're some other sponsor, consider sharing, perhaps at the next annual public forum venue, your own experiences with what you've been doing with external evidence, because I think this sort of opportunity to share in a pre-competitive space what we're doing is the sort of thing that helps to advance the science and gets the therapies out to patients quicker. Next slide, please. So Vandana went over this previously, but I'll just sort of give my take on it. So external data that's generated outside of a contemporaneous clinical study. That could be historical clinical trial data, that could be modeling and simulation data, registries, electronic health records, maybe administrative, claims, billing records. Now, several of those, the registries, electronic health records, administrative data, those are examples of real world data. But that isn't the only source that we want to be thinking about. There are these other possibilities, in particular the historical clinical trial data, which could potentially be of great use. So it's helpful to think about the EEM work as something that is a superset of the important focus on RWD and RWE, but something for which we believe we can think of in a slightly broader context. And in this scenario, when we're talking about external data, we're usually considering the combination of some external information with some currently generating clinical study information. Like there exists the well-written guidance document from the FDA on RWE and RWD. In some cases, there are certain things you can do that are solely based upon information not from a trial. For instance, ways in which you might be able to address certain post-market questions can be done that way. But here, what we're talking about is primarily around that combination. And so, like if you look on the right, this is an example where you can see two different sources of water coming together. And maybe one is coming more from fields, there's a lot more silt in the water, you get that brown color. One's coming more from a rockier stream bed where it doesn't have that suspension. And so you're seeing the mixture come together. So think of two sets of information that we want to combine when we're doing these analyses. Next slide, please. So another way to think about this in sort of a generic framework, and I'll use portions of this for a couple slides going forward, is that there's this full data spectrum of examples of different data sources. If you look at the sort of the pictogram here, the outline of the person, that might correspond to traditional clinical trial patient data. You have the two arms here for the blue and the yellow. But even beyond what you get of a traditional clinical trial, perhaps there's data to be coming from an implantable active device, something coming from your pacemaker. That's like that heart with the beat symbol on it. Or perhaps something's coming from your Apple Watch or your Fitbit. That might be your wearable external device. Maybe it's a trial too, or study where you're interested in pulling in some patient-reported outcomes, and perhaps it's being done through questionnaires pushed out through a smartphone. You could also consider incorporating either electronic health records or billing records. And then there's also the possibility of outside the trial, perhaps that you have access to modeling and simulation. There's a good model out there for a heart. Maybe you're going to use that in some manner to incorporate into your study, as well as the smaller outlines of the people on the left-hand side. Maybe there's historical trial data. So this is just to indicate that there's a variety of sources that you could potentially be in play that you might want to incorporate into your planned analysis. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to go through 3 different examples that I had visibility to while I was at Medtronic. And so I've shared this broad content before, focus on them again here. And this is material that had been prepared by Jenny Anderson from Medtronic. This particular setting is around the Impact Admiral drug-coated balloon, where the intended use is for peripheral artery disease of the superficial femoral or popliteal arteries. And it's within this Admiral platform, this balloon, multiple different diameters, multiple different lengths, using paclitaxel with urea as an excipient. Next slide, please. So for this platform, there's some history with the FDA regarding some indication changes. So it started off as a Class 3 combination product for which the PMA approval came on December 30th. The first indication change had to go with predilation to the vessel prep. I'm going to focus here upon the second indication around adding in-stent restenosis. But there also have been a later change around going to a longer lesion length, as well as to add additional sizes of balloons to the product. And so if you look here in terms of the text that's highlighted, these are the changes talking about. So the first change had to do with that vessel change, the predilation vessel prep. Then the in-stent restenotic, that's the second indication change we're going to focus on here. And then the 360 millimeters, that's the third indication change referred to. Next slide, please. So the idea here is that the in-stent restenosis in peripheral artery disease is an unmet clinical need. And the reason for this is that the presence of a foreign body, your stent, that can stimulate the proliferation of your smooth muscle cells, and that results in the hyperplasia and the re-narrowing of the artery. So the stent initially is helpful, physically keeping the artery open, but then the cells grow around it, things narrow down. So the issue has to do with management of in-stent restenosis, ISR. And that requires repeated and complex interventions, which can impact both the quality of life and the healthcare costs. That was a significant unmet clinical need. So the original work only included native vessel treatment, and the existing approved therapies had the low effectiveness results. Next slide, please. So the idea for how that might change of going from that set was to say, well, what is the full set of data that's available? Well, the Impact SFA Global Clinical Program had multiple components. There was the Impact SFA 1 and 2 trial with 331 subjects in the US and Europe. There was a global study that had multiple cohorts in it, including a CTO imaging cohort, a long lesion imaging cohort, and an ISR imaging cohort. There's also a PK sub-study. Separate to those 3, there was also the Impact SFA Japan study, an RCT with 100 subjects, and an SFA China study with 143. So pulling from these different sources, the team was able to put together an ISR PMA cohort with subjects that met their criteria, consisting of 164 subjects. Next slide, please. So the general regulatory strategy, we approached the FDA, when Medtronic did, to discuss utilizing the Impact Global Study with the ISR subjects. But appropriately, there's a consideration to add a control arm to assist with the risk-benefit ratio labeling. Well, where would we get that from? We worked hard to get the ISR subjects. Well, it turns out that this is a scenario where there was a national registry around that could be appropriate, relevant, reliable, to have data on a control arm. This would be for the PTA subjects. So Medtronic and the FDA agreed that the VQI registry database could be utilized for the control subjects. So then a pre-specified plan was put together on how to analyze the data, was agreed to, and Medtronic utilized a third party to analyze data. This is along the concept of trying to separate out who has access to patient level outcome data when you want to bring in data that's from which it's already occurred. There's multiple discussions with the FDA utilizing the pre-sub process. And the final plan, what was done was there was a clinical evidence that was obtained through an observational propensity score adjusted comparative analysis comparing that impact global study and the PTA subjects from the VQI registry database. Next slide, please. So this is a thing where what was done, if you go back to my prior slide with the multiple sources, is there's this clinical study, the global study, we pulled the subjects from the blue with only the active arm. But then in comparison, there's the registry patients coming from those yellow subjects. So this is the most common form of studies using external evidence that has been reported in the survey that we did. So there's a survey component to this framework document as well. So this concept is not necessarily new. People are willing to share about it, but it's useful to sort of stress this is the way it's set up. Next slide, please. Now, there's certainly things that have been done beyond that approach. So one thing that happened previously with MDIC is multiple industry members, including Medtronic employees and the FDA staff, collaborated on a successful effort to develop a new statistical methodology for incorporating prior information into clinical trial analyses. This particular one was a variant of some existing Bayesian approaches. It's something that was a main paper is focused on using engineering models for the prior. I need to update this again. I believe it's actually higher than number 7 most read, benefit of open access publications. And then beyond that publication, there was actually a meeting we had a couple of years ago now on a workshop at the FDA campus to discuss technical issues around the method. And at that time, we received strong endorsement from both the Division of Cardiovascular Devices head, Bram Zuckerman, as well as Division of Biostat head at that time, Ram Tewari. Next slide, please. So an example of using that method, there's a clinical study with historical data from the spiral HTN-OFF study. So this is a treatment for treatment-resistant hypertension, in that case, treatment being drugs. Now we're pharmacological effects. Now we're looking at using the device. And so in this particular case, we're talking about the spiral HTN pivotal study, for which it was utilizing information from a prior study that was more of a pilot approach. So those two studies were conducted very similarly, similar inclusion-exclusion criteria, follow-up period. So there was this plan to say, what can you learn from that pilot portion, and to what extent might it be applicable to the analysis of the later full study? So the patients from that HTN-OFF study contribute to the full analysis of the HTN pivotal study, yielding a lower overall sample size than running 2 independent studies. This is something that took a lot of discussion back and forth. It's much more complex than the prior examples we stated. But I do think that this concept of finding a way to utilize one prior set of trial information with a new set of trial information certainly does seem promising. There's a variety of analytical methods you could use. This is one particular way, but I think it's certainly something that other sponsors should be considering for their development plans. Next slide. So a third case would be an approach. This is now something where you can think about how the EM framework leads you forward. So as a reminder, the EM framework document talked about what we'd seen for submissions that had already, for which a decision had already been reached, right? Now I'm talking about more how you could use this in terms of your future development planning. So this is in the diabetes setting here. We had key stakeholders that had expressed interest in exploring alternative study designs, mostly because we knew that there'd be a variety of product improvements coming along, both in the algorithm side and with sensors. And there's this opportunity then to think about a set of trials, not just an individual trial in isolation. And with diabetes, what's interesting is that there's already a published virtual patient model for glucose dynamics in type 1 diabetics. The reference to the paper you can see in this slide and a little bit of the schematic in the picture below. Next slide, please. So the concept there would be to say, okay, can we run a clinical trial, 2 arms going forward, but incorporate this virtual patient information modeling and simulation framework? So it's to pursue this virtual patient strategy where the current virtual patient is a metabolic model that predicts glucose response to different insulin therapy regimens. And we actually have a very large pool, thousands of virtual patients that were developed from real data. And so that gives you a real opportunity to either have things that are matched to real patients or perhaps give you more representation in otherwise hard to enroll subgroups. Next slide, please. So, for methods here in which you could go forward with this, there's a variety of methods that have previously been used to support regulatory decisions based on external evidence. This ranges from the creation of performance goals or objective performance criteria. There's multiple applications of either propensity score matching or weighting or stratification. There's different applications of Bayesian hierarchical modeling or Bayesian commensurate prior approach. And there's even been further development, the cardinality matching as opposed to propensity score matching. working with a discount power prior approach. It's been done in multiple ways. Or perhaps a propensity score integrated power prior approach or propensity score integrated composite likelihood approach. Very nice developments that come out in part through authorship from staff at the FDA. So the survey that we've put together in this framework document, it's useful for an inclusive documentation sense. Here are examples we have seen for which there's been public regulatory decisions, but it is not to say that it's restrictive. So it's not an exhaustive census. There certainly, we would hope, are additional approaches that haven't yet gotten to the decision standpoint yet, or perhaps it's from groups, maybe it's from a small company that didn't participate in the survey. So you can go to our framework to hear about some examples of things that have happened, but certainly other approaches are possible as well. Next slide, please. All this is to say that, what we're talking about with this framework approach, we're trying to push towards medical device innovation. But innovation and safety, they're not polar opposites, but they're rather two sides of the same coin. So perhaps there needs to be discussion in these interactions around the extent to which you might be using a method for which it's less well understood versus more well understood. And that brings around the innovation standpoint. But the safety is also tied to it in terms of, well, what else would you have to assess before you felt comfortable with that method, with that data set? So those two issues of innovation and safety, they go hand in hand. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, then, this concept of working with multiple sources of information is not new. There's many established methods, but there's still room for new methods development or application of unusual existing approaches. For a lot of sponsors, the challenges in leveraging that external evidence may be more related to non-methods questions, perhaps finding the right data source that can be useful, establishing your relevance reliability, or gaining alignment, perhaps even internally might be more challenging in your particular setup than externally, that your proposal is appropriate for a particular regulatory decision. So the MDIC external evidence methods framework we developed and received great comment on, we were close to finalizing, that document provides a useful reference of past successes and future possibilities. And as a community, we'll make progress when we can share pre-competitively lessons learned and make improvements to the process of using external information. Next slide. So if you do have any further questions, please feel free to contact me at my BridgeBio email address. And with that, that wraps up the 3 separate presentations. Randy, now I'll hand it back off to you for our panel discussion at the end of the session.
Thank you, Ted. Lily, you described in your talk the ongoing efforts within CDRH on real-world data and with the National Evaluation System Technology Coordinating Center. How do you see the unique contributions of the external evidence framework document to the effort of leveraging real-world data and real-world evidence? Lily, please respond, and Ted can provide his perspective next.
Thank you for the question, Randy. So the EM framework document discusses the statistical methods in both Bayesian and frequentist settings in details. So the methods can be readily used in the design, analysis, and evaluation of clinical evidence generated through TPLC of medical devices. Also, the methods can be leveraged in the NEST-CC method framework. Thank you.
Yeah, and I'll just add some additional context there. Thank you very much for those comments, Lily. Especially when we think about the recent release that came out from FDA CDRH around the multiple use cases that have happened with RWD and regulatory decisions coming from that. What happens differently here with the EEM framework is we're allowing people to think a bit more broadly than just real-world data, real-world evidence. Real-world data and real-world evidence is an important component of external evidence methods that we might be able to use for structured analyses of clinical trial data. But in many cases, it's going to be some combination. And by having a framework that allows for us to also consider the possible use of modeling and simulation or of earlier historical clinical trial data, and thinking about that, in fact, the methods for that are often very similar. They're not driven by the source of the data. It helps to give a better context and hopefully allow us to be more efficient about different approaches we could use to get out the therapies to the patients faster. Thanks, Randy.
Thank you, Lily and Ted. Next question, Vandana. In many cases, when designing a clinical study leveraging external data may have already been collected and clinical outcomes may already be available. How can one ensure the scientific validity and interpretability of study results? Vandana, if you would start, and then Lily and Ted can add.
Sure. Thank you, Randy. I think it's really important to understand what aspects can be considered at the time of designing the study, such that the results that we obtain after using any of the methods listed in the External Evidence Methods Framework document provide us with results that are valid and interpretable, from regulatory perspective to be able to make regulatory decisions. And one of the key aspects, as I pointed out in my talk as well, is having an outcome-free approach. Ensuring that if for example, propensity score design is being implemented, then the outcome stays out of sight. So there is, for example, an independent statistician can be involved who does not have access to the outcome data, and then that person is doing the propensity score modeling, is ensuring whether there is covariate balance, whether the propensity score distributions have sufficient overlap. And then once the modeling and the balance assessment has been done, and there has been agreement between, having the sponsor see it, FDA see it, and the independent statistician, then outcome analysis should be done. So that's, I think, one of the main factors whenever leveraging external data, to ensure that there is that sort of a firewall built in so that we can ensure there is, validity and interpretability of the study results can be made. So Ted, if you have more to add to it, or Lily?
Not a whole lot more. I think you did a great job on it. I think it just simply comes down to the fact that in order to draw a valid inference, we need to make sure that we aren't claiming we learned something about something we already know the answer to, right? So it's just saying, okay, what do we know now? What are we combining? And in some cases, it could be that someone else has knowledge, but they're not involved with the analysis. This is the whole independent statistician approach. But as long as we just keep our heads about us and still do good science, I think we'll be in a good place. Lily, anything else from you?
Yeah, so I'd like to report that the outcome-free study design is a standard practice in device submissions, thanks to great efforts made by statisticians from FDA and the industry. Thank you.
Very good. Very practical responses. Ted, if you'd take this one first. You mentioned in your presentation novel statistical methods for generating external evidence. From your experience, how can industry statisticians go about considering some of these novel approaches?
Yeah, it's a good question, Randy. So certainly we are a field that continually evolves. This is good just even from a professional development standpoint. It's like you want to work with people whose knowledge didn't retire well before they did. So we're always in a place where people need to stay up on latest methods, learn what the developments are, and go forward. So certainly, if you're with a company, you should be thinking about, are you staying on top of things? Are you reading the latest journals? Do you understand what's coming out? We've put together the External Evidence Methods Framework to help out with this. It's not a sole source of information, but it brings a lot of relevant information together where people can get a good start and understand what are good references to turn to train themselves. So I think there's a fair bit of ensuring that the people at the company have been trained. And there can also be appropriate points to, for instance, participate in external forums, the annual public forum here or an external conference, and have conversations either in a structured format or informal with perhaps other industry statisticians, or if you have a chance, a good opportunity to discuss informally with FDA statisticians, things that they should be considering, not to get a pre-read or anything, but just to sort of understand people that have worked with these techniques before, what are things to consider. So I think it's more just along the lines of saying it's new for everyone, but this isn't the first thing that's been new over time. We're used to dealing with this situation, and just keep going forward as you've done in the past.
Yeah, and I think just to chime in more on what Ted just spoke, definitely we also have training inside FDA on novel methodologies, so where statisticians get to learn on what some of these novel techniques. But I think from having an early conversation with FDA. We have the QSA process. I think that's really important. Whenever sponsors or companies are thinking about leveraging external data, using novel methodology or even methodologies that they may have already utilized in other places, I think having that early conversation with FDA, come in with the QSub, because it's really important to also understand, from a regulatory perspective as to whether the external data is fit for purpose. So all those aspects can be kind of talked through and sorted out early on. I think that's really the main message I would like to convey here.
Yeah, also it's a teamwork of clinicians, statisticians, and engineers, as well as other scientists from both sides, FDA and the industry.
Very good, Lily. Thank you for that input. It's clearly a team activity within industry, within the government, and between industry and the government. Okay, one final question to all the panelists. What are some of the biggest challenges regarding using external evidence and external data in regulatory decisions?
So I'll take an initial stab at that. It's many things we've already talked about. So Vandana was talking earlier about the issue of understanding if it's fit for purpose. And some of the language that's regularly used, for example, in the RWD, RWE guidance, is establishing relevance and reliability for sources. So, having a conversation ahead of time to understand if you want to pull in this external evidence, how appropriate is it? Is this something that is very similar to what you're working with, or there are important differences? If there are important differences, can those be handled through analytical approaches? Can those be handled through subsetting? How would you account for it? Is it something that's going to sort of change the degree in which you rely on it, or is it going to change the members of the population you work with? But a lot of it has to do with identifying that source of information that you want to use. There is some tied into with the methods too. If you're familiar with the various methods and how to ensure that you can't just apply it yourself, but to check your work, making sure that you've got enough people to validate your work as well. But I would say the main thing seems to be getting alignment with everyone involved about identifying that relevant, reliable information that can be used to supplement the information you have going forward in the new study.
Thanks, Ted.
Lily or Vandana?
Sure. I think, Ted, you said it very well, but just to add to it, I think one of the places where I think there may be somewhat more challenging to leverage external data would be, for example, when we're thinking about electronic health records as one of the external data source. So far, I think we have had more experience utilizing registries, utilizing historical clinical studies as external data and leveraging those into prospective studies. But so I think those things have to be probably sorted out as we venture through this, approach of utilizing electronic health records as well. So I think it's definitely a collaboration between industry and FDA to figure out how best to do so and how we can move forward with that.
Yeah, Ted and Vandana have already covered very well. I just like to add one point. I see the need to develop new and novel statistical methods that can be used to handle different situations when leveraging RWD and RWE. I think it would be a collaboration between statisticians, among academia, industry, and FDA. So let's work together and work out some new methodology.
Thank you very much to our panelists, Lily, Vandana, and Ted, as well as Jitesh Patil from MDIC and others that have contributed to this body of work over the past several years. We look forward to increased leverage of external evidence methods and real-world evidence to drive productivity and speed to market for the top quality products we can deliver. Thanks also to our audience participants. Enjoy the day.